Welcome to AP US History. I'm excited to get started in this course with you today. I do take these first couple of chapters a little bit out of order, so don't be alarmed by that. I prefer to start right here with the Great West and the Agricultural Revolution. We finished up 10th grade history with a look at, of course, the Civil War and Reconstruction. There are huge changes that brings about. That really does usher in a new modern America, a totally new direction. And one of those things was westward expansion. And the Civil War did provide many opportunities for westward expansion to really be incentivized, to be helped along, both by environmental factors, by economic factors, by government intervention even. So that's where I like to start, and then we'll go back and also look at what was happening simultaneously in the East, in cities, in industry, and eventually that brings us to a big sort of a showdown between the interests of agriculturalists and the West and farmers versus the interests of the industries and the banks and all those kinds of things. So today what we're going to look at is, of course, the inevitable conflict that westward expansion is no doubt going to occur. And it's interesting, the West, when we think about the West, one, in 10th grade, we looked at the West a lot. The West kind of changed as far as where we were talking about. You know, at first that was like Ohio, and then that might have been maybe Missouri or Minnesota or something like that. When we think about the West, just culturally as Americans, we tend to think of, the Wild West. We think of the tumbleweeds, and we think of the bar fight in the saloon and all that sort of thing. And we're thinking of Nevada and Arizona and those kind of places. And at this point, that is the West that we are more talking about. And this is a region, of course, that has long been associated with myth and with mystique and with stereotypes like the bar fight in the saloon and cowboys and Indians and, that sort of a thing, which there's, some of those things are maybe somewhat based in some truth, but a lot of it, of course, has been sensationalized, has been romanticized, that kind of thing, by Wild West shows, by movies, by TV, that kind of stuff. But the West has for so long, whether you were talking about, Indiana or wherever, has for so long been, this symbol of freedom, this symbol of democracy, this kind of untouched place. And the West was a place that was not really touched by the Civil War. So perhaps that's one of the reasons why we see this move out there at the end of it. It becomes a symbol of economic freedom, of economic opportunity, a place where displaced farmers, where former slaves could go after the Civil War. But it does have a tragic side to it as well. It is also a story of greed, of irresponsibility, of people abusing the land, whether for agricultural purposes or for mining, and of course, the tragedy of what this meant for indigenous people, what this meant for Native Americans, the collapse of Native American resistance, and ultimately the collapse of a lot of Native American cultures. So that's what we're going to be looking at today, is talking about that interaction and talking a little bit about that Native American resistance, how it ultimately ended, how it ultimately defeated, and what that meant for both white American settlers and for Native Americans. So Native Americans, as we know, have, ever since the first arrival of the first Europeans in the 1500s, have been struggling and fighting to maintain their land, their hunting grounds, their culture, their dignity, all of those things against encroachment by white settlers. That's been an ongoing concept. That's not new to us. And so certainly that continues beyond the Civil War into these Western territories. And we call all of these conflicts the frontier wars. So the frontier wars refers to these various Native American conflicts with several Native American nations. This is not just one particular tribe. There were some that were more resistant and were more difficult for the United States to defeat than others. But any of those conflict with Native American nations occurring from the 1860s until about the 1890s, off and on, we refer to as the frontier war. So as Americans are pushing further west, they are encroaching upon more and more Native American lands. That leads to conflict between them and settlers. And eventually the United States government and the United States Army makes it a policy to remove them from their lands and to force them onto reservations. And for years leading up to these frontier wars, and then during these frontier wars, Native American populations had definitely been receding, which means shrinking. because of disease, because of conflict with settlers, because of environmental changes, because of other things that were causing them to be reduced in numbers and their strength to be reduced. Another big factor that led to receding Native American populations, that led to increased weakness in Native American resistance, was the near extinction of the buffalo. There's a reason why I have a buffalo here. The buffalo, the Plains Indians, are the Native Americans that we refer to. That is a general term that refers to so many different tribes in the Great Plains, region, like the Sioux and the Nez Perce and people like that. And the buffalo, these were typically nomadic Native Americans, that the buffalo was crucial to their way of life. It was a very sacred animal. They used it for everything. It was even a currency to them. It wasn't just a food source. They used the hides and the skins for clothing, for shelters. They used the bones for tools. And that buffalo were being hunted, overhunted, just slaughtered wholesale by white settlers. And so they were pushed nearly to extinction. And that just destroyed these Native Americans' livelihood. And that's one of the reasons why they eventually ran out of the capacity to fight back. It had to do with the depletion of that buffalo population. Yes, the Native Americans hunted them, but they hunted only what they needed and took only what they needed, and then respected the animal itself, whereas white hunters were coming in and just killing as many they could for their skins, their furs, and so forth. For example, these pictures, you see this guy here just standing on top of these skulls of buffalo, and you see the carcasses here and the pelts, the furs just stacked up, and so that depletes the population nearly to extinction. And that's a big reason why Native Americans found themselves so weakened and so unable to fight back. There are, of course, numerous fights in the frontier wars. We're going to look at two major battles of the frontier wars and talk about them for a moment, some particular ones that stand out in the grand scheme of things and all this Native American resistance. The first of which is known as the Battle of Little Bighorn, which occurred in June of 1876. The Battle of Little Bighorn, this happened in what would today be South Dakota. One of the Native American nations that was particularly violent and particularly, well, I shouldn't say violent, they're defending themselves, particularly difficult and put up the strongest and the hardest resistance was a Native American nation called the Sioux, which is spelled Sioux, if you're wondering. The Sioux nation was particularly resistant to American pushing onto their land and trying to hang on to their land. They had been quite difficult to defeat. And in this particular case, the general that you see here right above my face, that guy right there, that's General George Custer. And General George Custer was commanding American forces going into this battle. He found the main encampment of Sioux warriors in what we call the Black Hills of South Dakota. And this land had particularly become interesting to Americans because gold had been discovered there. And so they were increasingly trying to get on Native American lands. And then Custer finds their main encampment. He wants to attack them, but he gets cut off from the main part of the army, and he and his couple thousand men end up totally surrounded and outnumbered by the Sioux, and they get completely destroyed. So at the Battle of Little Bighorn, Custer and all of his men, probably about a couple hundred, get surrounded by more than 2,000 Sioux warriors, and they are, every single last one of them, Custer included, killed in this battle. And this is what is sometimes called Custer's last stand, because it literally was his last stand. So they were slaughtered by the Sioux. And while this is a victory for the Sioux, it is a victory they're not able to follow up on, and it is something that really increases the United States' resolve to defeat Native American resistance. So they kind of start coming at them harder after this, and the Sioux are not able to really follow up. And so the United States Army will soon regain the offensive, although people were publicly outraged by Custer's last stand and look at these brutal Native Americans. We need to, go after them harder and that kind of a thing. So it sort of changes their policy towards them, making them far more aggressive. But again, they do not follow up on that. So the fighting continues. Native American resistance continues to be whittled away at, continues to be, broken bit by bit. Native Americans defeated, sent to reservations, all of that, and to where Native American resistance was pretty much crushed and over with by the time you get to about 1880. But what we consider certainly the end of the frontier wars, and what also marks a shift in policy towards Native Americans, where we I almost want to say thankfully, but you'll see what I mean in a second. But where the United States policy does shift away from trying to fight Native Americans is after an incident known as the Massacre at Wounded Knee, which occurs in December of 1890. And this, let me go ahead and put this up here. In this time in the late 1880s, 1890s, a tradition, a craze, if you will, had swept amongst a lot of Native Americans something called the ghost dance. And the ghost dance was this religious ceremony that a lot of these Native American groups would perform, which they believed would bring back the buffalo, would bring back their lands, would restore everything that had been lost, everything that had been taken and stolen from them over the past several decades. And this ghost dance seemed to American officials, seemed to the U.S. Army to be like an uprising, and they were very nervous about it. And so they had banned it, and they had told Native Americans on reservations and on their territories that they couldn't do this. And in this particular situation, Native Americans here at Wounded Knee were engaging in this ritual. They were participating in this ghost dance. And the American soldiers, the army that was around, misunderstood it and assumed and thought that they were trying to rebel, that they were getting themselves pepped up for a fight, that was imminent. And so they ordered them to stop. And these Native Americans, just regular folks, stopped, are putting down any weapons that they may have held, and one thing leads to another, and the United States Army just opens fire into these people and kills most of them. And they slaughter hundreds of people, a lot of them women, a lot of them children, and just a really, really ugly situation. Killing more than 300, most of them unarmed, almost all of them unarmed Sioux at this massacre. You can see why it's called a massacre at Wounded Knee. The significance of this, one, we consider this the end of the frontier wars, that this is kind of the last major fight, if you can really call this a fight, between the United States Army and Native American resistance. Really, Native American resistance, as I already said, had really already been crushed by this point. There really was no Native American resistance by this point, but this is definitely the end of it, the absolute end of it. Furthermore, this causes an outrage as well. Whereas Custer's Last Stand causes an outrage in the form of, look at these mean Native Americans, we've got to go after them, they're so brutal, they're so terrible. This is where people kind of go, look how bad the United States has been, look how terrible this is. These poor people, we are mistreating them. But don't get too excited about that. Not in the sense that we might think of it today. There had been a lot of reform-minded people that had been protesting, complaining, trying to bring attention to the way Native Americans had been treated and saying, hey, this is wrong. People like Helen Hunt Jackson, for example, you see this, am I pointing the right way? This essay that she had written, A Century of Dishonor, talking about the way that Native Americans had for centuries been mistreated, their lands taken, treaties that were fraudulent, treaties that were then, retracted, all this kind of stuff, the United States not keeping its word, so forth and so on, and saying this is absolutely wrong. More public opinion starts to sway in her favor there as a result of Wounded Knee. People go, you know what, she's right. They have been treated badly. However, that does not mean they've been treated badly, we should give them back their land. They've been treated badly, we should start being nice. It is more, they move toward a policy of assimilation. Instead of fighting Native Americans, a policy of assimilating them. And one thing this is where we have to kind of look at things differently. The policy of assimilation to us is going to seem quite terrible and disturbing maybe. In these days, people like Helen Hunt Jackson, this was a very reform-minded, very forward-thinking policy. This was kind of seen as the good way, the right way, the moral thing to do. Assimilation means to absorb. If you're being assimilated into a culture, that means you're being absorbed into that culture. So the policy of assimilation is the policy of essentially forcing Native Americans to abandon their tribal identity, abandon their tribal culture, to basically stop being Native Americans and be white American citizens, to act and behave like white American farmers, to farm, to practice Christianity, to speak English, which a lot of them already did anyway. But to force them to abandon that culture and to adopt something else and to make them one of us, to say we're going to stop treating them like an obstacle we have to get rid of, we're going to bring them into the fold, which again, maybe that's better than fighting them. I think you could argue that, possibly, but it is also basically an attempt to erase their particular culture, and a lot of cultures do not survive because of that. The main way that the United States government goes by or tries to implement this policy, which again, at the time, this was like the nice way to do it, was a law called the Dawes Act, which was passed in 1887. So the main purpose of the Dawes Act is assimilation. This is about how they would accomplish assimilation and what that's going to mean. And assimilation had been tried in the past, and had it kind of sort of but had been abandoned for other reasons. Here's what the Dawes Act does and how assimilation would be accomplished. The Dawes Act dissolves tribal ownership of land. By this point, tribes were on reservations, but it's basically saying that the United States government does not recognize those reservations anymore. It's getting rid of that reservation system for a while. It is saying we don't recognize this as Cherokee land or Sioux land or Apache land or whatever. We're going to take those reservations. We're going to divide that up and sell that land, and Native Americans will instead become landowners. They can become farmers like everybody else. So it's dissolving that, and it's offering that land up for sale for Native Americans to purchase, and then whatever's left over, anybody gets. Anybody can have. Anybody that wants to pay for it can, which is why you see this cartoon here of the guy, eating up the Native American lands, and why you see this advertisement right here above me about Native American land for sale. It also means that the United States government would, from this point until a while from then, not recognize tribal sovereignty, which means they're no longer, up until this point, the relationship between the United States government and Native American tribes have been one of government to government. We communicate with you as if we would a foreign nation almost. No more. This is saying we don't recognize tribal ownership of land. We don't recognize tribal leadership. We don't recognize tribal anything. We're not dealing with you as tribes anymore. We're dealing with you as individual people, just like we would individual American citizens. Now, the carrot in this, the reward is that if Native Americans accept this and become good farmers and all these kind of things, they get American citizenship. They get to be American citizens just like everybody else. You can see where some people would say this was a good thing, this was a good idea, and all of that, but the results of it are really quite mixed. Most Native Americans, first of all, do not have the means to acquire land still. So they still can't get any. And two, the Dawes Act just completely ignores the idea and did not understand people who designed this. The whole concept of land ownership to Native Americans was completely foreign and in many cases offensive. Land ownership, the idea that someone could own land, the idea of private property, that is something that had never, ever, 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 ever been a part of Native American culture for centuries. They had been people that had, amongst all their differences, that was a common thread, a belief in communal living, a sacredness of nature, and the fact that you could own land, that just did not make sense to most people. And so they did not understand or refuse to accept that, just refused to accept the idea that they would be landowners. That was just, against everything they had ever believed in, and they just could not get behind that. So a lot of them rejected for that reason or could not afford land, those kind of things. And which means that land's now available to white settlers, and that just further disrupts their culture. Most of the land that they are able to get is not very well suited for farming. Farming in those areas can be quite difficult. So there are plenty who maybe tried to take it up and we're not successful with it, and we're not able to make anything of it. So it really just results in Native American culture being further disrupted, Native American culture being destroyed, some of them being completely annihilated, and Native Americans falling further into a cycle of poverty and other ugly things that come along with that. Now, if you're wondering as far as, is this the way the United States government deals with Native Americans today? Thankfully, no. The Dawes Act does eventually get reversed. The United States does recognize tribal sovereignty now. It does recognize tribal ownership of land, those kind of things. But the problem still persists. While there are some Native American tribes that are quite wealthy, there are some that do very, very well and have plenty of economic opportunities. The Porch Creek Indians, for example, in Alabama, financially, pretty good. But there are others, particularly in the Southwest, that still, even today in 2020, don't have running water. And that's, that not something that just happened overnight. That's really the result of, centuries of this kind of a thing. So Native American resistance all but crushed after Wounded Knee. And from there, we have, sorry, I'm going to get my screen right. And then from there, the Dawes Act to encourage assimilation. So what we'll be looking at next is what happens with that land as people start to move west, taking a look at agriculture and how that is eventually the thing that really makes the West that we probably think of when we think about those stereotypes and those tropes about the American West.